Hello, my name is Stephen Upton, and in this short film we're going to take a look at the British-Australian attack that took place in July of 1916 near to the French village of Fromelles. It involved the 5th Australian and the 61st British Divisions. Fromelles is situated just south of Armentières and was captured by the Germans in the first few months of the war in 1914, and it remained firmly in their hands throughout almost the entire war. On this present-day map, the red arrow now shows a German cemetery. There are several British cemeteries, and also near the wood there is where the mass graves were found, and the final marker is the current new visitor centre. This trench map is from 1916. The blue lines at the top are the British trenches and the red ones at the bottom the German. Where the red circle is on the right, that's where we start filming. But please also take note of the feature called the Sugarloaf, because that features quite strongly in this story. And also, as we zoom in now, notice how the Sugarloaf on the left there not only can fire across no man's land, but directly down it towards where the marker is, where today the Australian Memorial is. That's where we take up our story now. Because the land round here is extremely flat and the water table quite high, in most places there was breastworks as opposed to trenches. They were concrete German machine gun emplacements, and this is the German second line. We're looking towards the German front line, and in the far distance, the British front line. But look how completely flat it is. The Australians and the British advanced over this land in broad daylight, nothing to hide behind, but we're looking now from the German second line towards where the Sugarloaf was, straight down no man's land. This is the Australian Memorial. In this two-day attack, the British division sustained 1,500 casualties, but the Australians, and this was their first major attack in France of the war, sustained over 5,500. That's Fromelles Church there in the middle, in the distance. But 5,500 Australian casualties. The Australians managed to penetrate as far as here to the German second line, and they held on for one night. Sadly, the Germans were able to counterattack and force them back out of their lines. So at the end of the 2 days, the British-Australian forces were back where we started from. That there in the distance is VC Corner British Military Cemetery, and it commemorates the Australians that were killed here. It's also roughly on the line of the German front line. It's quite amazing how flat this land is, and as a consequence it was very difficult to dig trenches, so most of the defences were breastworks. We now move through into the village of Fromelles, and this is a museum where you can study the battle in more detail. It's only very recently been built, opened in 2014. On first entering the museum, you find there's a shop and reception area where you pay a small fee for coming in. If I remember correctly, I think it was €5, or if you're over 60 like me, €4. But we're now inside the museum proper now, and you can see they've recreated British and German dugouts. That's a British one. You've got the curved wriggly tin over the top of it. A British officer there inspecting his trench map. Lots of it made out of sandbags and wood. And you see he's actually stood in a fairly shallow trench, only about a foot deep, and the rest of it's then built up above ground. Here's a German. So I have a sentry. What you see on the ground there was a water pump. And this is another German dugout with bunks inside of it. Because the Germans regard themselves as being here to stay, they went to great lengths to try and get a little bit of home comforts in their dugouts. On the 1st of July 1916, the British launched their massive offensive on the Somme, which of course on the first day went terribly wrong. by this time we're now 19 days into the Somme offensive, and it's intended to launch an attack here at Fromelles to pin the German reserves away from the Somme. The Germans were rushing reserves from all over the place to the Somme, and by having or staging diversionary attacks such as this, it was to keep the Germans guessing as to what we were up to. So this attack was intended to pin German reserves in position. And I suppose it worked to some extent, however, at what cost? 7,000 casualties. Now, this table's very interesting because there's a laser projector down onto it, showing you exactly what took place. That yellow shaded area is the British front line. You've got the British 61st Division on the left there and the Canadians on the right. And now they're drawing in the German front line. And the German area is defended by the 6th Bavarian Reserve Division. And there's our infamous Sugarloaf. And you can see from the position of it how it has commanding views not just across no man's land but down sideways across no man's land, which is what the big problem was. Those little squares with upside down numbers are the battalion numbers of the British. The 61st Division was a South Midland Division, so you've got a Warwickshire Brigade and a Worcestershire Brigade. And these squares are the Australian battalions. They were just numbered, 54, 53rd Battalion, and the lines are the boundaries between different infantry brigades. You see there's 5 little squares grouped into 3 groups. That's 3 brigades of infantry, each having 5 battalions that make up the Australian Infantry Division. The British division was actually quite under strength at the time, so you find that there's only 2 or 3 battalions per brigade. The Australian division was a very strong division. I think this bit now is actually symbolised in either night time or possibly the fog of war. If it's the fog of war, it works because you can't see anything. But those little coloured squares are the Australian battalions. You can see the brigade boundaries, and this depicts now the Allied, the British and Australian artillery barrage, which takes place prior to the assault. And of course the German counter-battery fire, and also the Germans know there's an attack coming, so they direct their artillery at our assembly points, our forming up areas. They know we're manning the forward lines with troops ready to go to the attack, so they target them. And also during the attack they bring down a curtain of artillery fire in no man's land to try and break it up, and also to prevent reinforcements getting through. Once the British and Australians were into the German lines, the Germans were then going to counter-attack, and they didn't want us to be able to reinforce those initial attacking troops. So artillery played a very big role in that. The coloured squares that you can see with numbers are battalion designations. They're Australian. So they're with the 53rd Infantry Battalion. And they're all part of the 5th Australian Division. To the right, which we're just panning left, we'll come back to it in a moment, but the yellow lines moving forward is representing the infantry crossing no man's land, and the black dashy lines, the machine guns. And they say those, the 54, the 31, they're the different Australian infantry battalions. The upside down 21 is probably the German 21st, either regiment or infantry regiment or something of that nature. We're now looking at the 61st Division area. The 2/7 is the 2nd 7th Royal Warwickshire Regiment there. Well, you can see the way they were squeezed out of the German lines back across no man's land. The 2/6, that is the 2nd/6 Royal Warwicks, because that was the Royal Warwickshire Brigade, and there's a different 2/6. That's another 6th Battalion, I believe from the Worcestershire Brigade, so the Worcestershire Battalion. Now this is back to the Australian front. You can see their penetration was a lot deeper than the British. but again the Germans counter-attacking, slowly squeezing them back out, back towards no man's land. Because so many of the casualties were then left behind in the German positions, the Germans had to do something with so many bodies that were lying around. Hence, they dug mass graves so they could clear their own front lines of the corpses. And I think it's wonderful that these graves have been discovered after so long, and so many of those soldiers now have individual graves and they have been identified. They were able to do this, of course, using modern DNA techniques. What we're seeing now is how the land was left at the end of the war, just a shell-hole wilderness, almost like a lunar landscape. But slowly over the years, they were able to reclaim the land. And as you can see how this map, it slowly transforms into the rich agricultural land that it is today. It's amazing how they recovered it. However, we mustn't forget the human cost. This was quite a tragedy. So many families losing people in what was really a 2-day diversionary attack. And we now see here faces of some of those individuals. We're now going to leave the visitor centre and walk a few yards to Pheasant Wood Military Cemetery, which is literally next door. And this cemetery was opened in 2010 and contains the remains of many of the Australian soldiers that were buried in the mass graves for so long. The British soldiers have been reburied in other cemeteries. One of the reasons why I'm interested in the First World War is that my own grandfather and his brother served throughout. Also, being ex-Royal Air Force myself, I have an interest in most matters military, but particularly the First World War. I'm also a member of the British Legion, and as such attend quite a number of funerals for veterans and Remembrance Day parades. What you're going to see scroll across the bottom of the screen now is the exhortation that's read out at these events. They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.